When I was in second grade, Sister Regis had one final lesson for my class before we celebrated our first Holy Communion. We had already studied the Last Supper and all the parts of the Mass. We had spent weeks learning that the bread and wine actually became the body and blood of Christ. We weren't quite sure how that happened, but we believed. I felt special because I was going to receive the Lord. He would now be living in me, making me a better person from within. For practice, Sister Regis brought some unconsecrated communion wafers for us to try so we wouldn't be surprised on the day of our first Holy Communion. My whole class lined up just like we would in church, hands folded, heads bowed. Then Sister Regis said the words that every child from those days never forgets. Sister said, "Whatever you do, don't chew the host." Remember that? Whatever you do, don't chew, because in those days it was considered disrespectful, I guess, to Jesus to chew. Well, now it was the early 1970s, and my pastor had started buying larger, more substantial communion hosts. They were puffy and even had a religious symbol stamped, imprinted in the wafer. So when I received this gigantic practice host, I panicked. In my head, I kept hearing, "Don't chew, don't chew." Now, folks, I've been told my whole life I have a big mouth, and I don't deny that. But back then, it was second grader size. And that practice host was supersized. So there was a problem. I remember thinking, receiving the Eucharist is difficult because Holy Communion is too much to swallow all at once. Isn't that true? All these years later, I would repeat the same sentiment. The Eucharist is too much for us to take in all at once. It's too grand, too holy, too precious, too mysterious, so transforming, so elusive, so undeserved, but so desired, so tangible and yet so transcendent. That's why we're having Draw Near this month. Our plan is to spend the next month as a parish breaking the Eucharist down into edible pieces and comprehensible bits that are more manageable to take in. Our purpose is to take this most important part of the Christian life and come to understand it better. When we do, our lives change. So let's get to it. As a much younger priest, I used to be invited to give retreats to teenagers. Once I hit 45 years old, all those gigs dried up. But to be honest, I'm fine with that. I often did these retreats with a friend of mine who was a sister. And one of the things we would do was we would hand out pieces of paper to the teenagers and ask them to fill out questions they might have in the morning. They could ask us anything they wanted. And then, during lunch, Sister and I would look at the questions to decide who would respond to them. I would unfold the papers, hand them to Sister, and she would answer the questions or look at them to figure out who would respond. It would go like this. Question 1, what is your favorite prayer? And Sister would say, "Oh, that's a good question. I'll take that one." Question 2, do you ever wear normal people clothes? And Sister would say, "Oh, I think that one's for me too." Question 3, how can we say that Jesus is true God and true man at the same time? And Sister would say, "Jamie, I think that one's for you." Thanks a lot, Sister. I can remember a young guy at a high school junior retreat. He wrote this question: "I'm really struggling with my faith. When I was younger, I think I had faith, but now I'm not so sure. I don't go to Mass very often, and when I do go, I feel closer to God, but it doesn't last long. High school's tough, so by Monday afternoon, the close to God feeling that I had from Sunday Mass is all but gone. And to be honest, I don't really experience God in the world much. I want to be a good person. What am I supposed to do? As I remember, Sister said, "Oh, I think that's a Father Jamie question too." You ever feel like that? You ever feel like the faith you once had doesn't have the power it used to? You ever feel like there's a disconnect between what we feel here at Mass and what we experience during the rest of the week? As I think back on it now, on that young man's question from 25 years ago, I see a strange similarity to the beginning of today's gospel. The apostles may have used different words, but they were asking the same thing. Lord, increase our faith. It's a cry for help. Lord, I'm unsure. I don't know where to turn. I had faith once, but now I'm so mixed up, I don't know what to believe. What am I supposed to do? Lord, increase my faith. Jesus shoots back a surprising response to his apostles. He says, if you had tiny faith, faith so small like a mustard seed, then you could tell that big mulberry tree to jump in the lake. It appears that Jesus is telling them, when it comes to faith, you start out with something small, like a tiny seed, and then you watch it grow. I mean, it would be great if faith comes in one instant moment, in a flash. Lord, increase my faith. There, you got it. Look, everyone, I'm Mother Teresa. Maybe it happens that way sometimes, but evidently that's not how it normally works. Faith starts out small, with a choice, an action, a prayer, a relationship, a moment of trust. And then with patience, faith expands, growing with the force of a mighty oak emerging from an acorn. If I could go back 25 years, I know exactly where I'd start with that young man. I'd ask him, have you wondered why you have a sense of faith at church? Have you figured out why you feel close to God at Mass? Let's take a look at it. Praying with other Christians is great. Singing spiritual music is uplifting. All those things are wonderful gifts. But that is not why we feel close to God at Mass. It is because of the little host, that tiny wafer of bread, consecrated, transformed into the body of Christ. It is small, but like a mustard seed, from the Eucharist can grow mighty faith. And there is a very straightforward and practical reason why. Archbishop Fulton Sheen, the famous television preacher, was once speaking to a large audience. After his presentation, a man came up begging, "Archbishop, please pray for my daughter-in-law." He told Sheen that she was a good person, but seemed lost. She was often sad and found life difficult. The man said he was trying to bring her into the Catholic faith, but something was holding her back. He even thought it might be the teaching on the Eucharist that was stopping her. Archbishop Sheen asked him if she was in the auditorium, and she was. So he invited her backstage, and they found a bench and sat down and began to talk. Archbishop Sheen asked her what she thought about God, and she said that she had nothing against the idea of God, but she didn't feel especially close to God, and so she never really heard his voice, never saw a vision. Because of that, she found it difficult to believe in God or practice religion. The Archbishop said, "I think I know what you're missing." He asked her, "Why isn't your husband with you here tonight?" And she said, "He's in the military. He's overseas. I miss him greatly." "Does he write to you?" "He does, twice a week." "Well, do you have children?" "Yes, 2. "Are they good children?" "They're wonderful." "Do they look like him?" "Oh, yes, they do." "What about your in-laws? Do they help you?" "They're very kind to me." "Are you or your children lacking in anything? Food, clothes, support?" "No, we have all that we need." So the Archbishop looked at her and asked, "Well, what more do you want?" Startled by his question, she looked at him with tears in her eyes And she said, I want my husband here with me. I want him back home, here. Archbishop Sheen said, oh, you want his presence. The thought of him, letters from him, the love of your family, even your children. It's not enough, is it? You want him present here, don't you? The Archbishop only identified what was obvious. It was her husband, his presence, his standing there, the sound of his voice, the touch of his hand, his real presence. That would satisfy her. In that moment, the woman understood Archbishop Sheen. She understood her own longing for something more. She felt distant from God because she didn't know God's presence. Right then and there, she embraced the Church's teaching on the Holy Eucharist. Think about the wonderful, powerful claim that we make as a Catholic Church when we gather around the altar for Mass and the priest, standing there in the place of Christ himself, says the words of Jesus from the Last Supper, "This is my body, this is my blood." Think of the beautiful thing that happens in our church. Jesus becomes present here. That's why the Eucharist is so satisfying to the believer, because it's not a symbol. It's not a representation. It's not a cheap imitation, but it's the real deal. Christ here present. I wish I could go back 25 years ago. I'd say to that young man, you tell me that you're lacking in faith, that you don't feel close to God, but you also tell me you don't go to Mass much. I would tell him, if he is serious about being close to God, if he wants to know God more personally, more concretely, if he wants to experience God's presence, then make the commitment to attend Mass regularly. To everyone here, if Mass is not a part of your weekly routine, commit to making it your habit. And for those of you who can swing it, try coming to Mass during the week as well. Just as that woman realized that she would only be satisfied when the soldier husband she loved so much walked through the door, we know too, only our loving God, present here, will satisfy us. And that's exactly what Jesus gave us in the Eucharist. One year during Lent, Jim decided he'd go to his college campus ministry Mass every day until Easter. He committed 40 days of daily Mass. He says that it changed everything, but now not how he expected it would. He thought his problems would go away. He expected his bills would get paid, his grades would improve, his girlfriend would be happier. He thought he'd get rewarded from God for going to Mass. But instead, something greater happened. Jim found that God's presence was very strong, even when he wasn't at Mass. He said it was like God started showing up everywhere, even in his troubles. He said his girlfriend might not have been happier, but he was. That's what happens. When the Holy Eucharist is your steady diet, you will see changes, not only in the way you experience Mass, but in the rest of your life as well. That's the main point I wanted to make today. When you fall in love with the Eucharist and embrace the reality that the real presence of our God is somehow captured in that little consecrated host and the precious chalice, then grace enables you to embrace the reality that God is present in other places that you wouldn't think to find him. Don't see going to Mass like you're going to the gas station. You know what I mean? Boy, it's been a tough week. I need to get to church and get some Jesus back in me. I caution you not to be tempted into that way of thinking. We're not here today to get gassed up for a cross-country trip into the profane. We're here at Mass to be totally transformed by the Eucharist. Being here at Mass doesn't give us God to get through the rest of our lives where God is not, but instead, We are here to be made new people, to be retrained to see with new eyes. Coming to Mass is not really about making room in our life for the Eucharist. It's about learning to live our lives Eucharistically, to be tuned, to be grateful for God, presence everywhere. Now you might say, that sounds too good to be true. Faith can't be that easy. Granted, it's a promise hard to believe. Much like if you were a servant and you came in from a field worn out, dirty, and tired, and what if I told you your master would be waiting there for you, saying, "Come in, take your place at the table. I got dinner all ready for you." Yes, it's hard to believe. A servant doesn't deserve that kind of care from a master. Hard to believe, and yet, that is the story Jesus tells us. Brothers and sisters, isn't that exactly what we experience here today? When we drag ourselves into church every Sunday, tired and worn out from all the challenges that we face in life, our Master says to us, "Come in, draw near, take your place at the table." You're having trouble in your family life? Draw near. Your food is ready for you. You don't like your job. You don't like your school. You feel like it's a dead end? Draw near. Let faith begin to transform you to see the presence of God even there. You've lost someone you love. You feel rejected or abandoned. You feel like God has completely walked out on you. Draw near. Experience His presence, and then be transformed as your faith grows like a mustard seed. Are you so disillusioned by our divisive politics in our country, or angered by our hobbled church? Draw near. Let His presence remind you, where else would He be but here to heal us? You're dealing with illness or the limitations of age. If you struggle to forgive someone who hurt you, draw near. Ashamed of your past, afraid for your future, draw near. Do you feel like you don't know God and have no clue where to begin? Draw near and begin to live Eucharistically. Because living Eucharistically, being aware of God's loving care at all times and in all places, Christians, that is the best way to live.